This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the second chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now, every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in years, and in divine and human favor. The Gospel of the Lord. So the days between Christmas Day and New Year's Day always seem like a kind of an in-between time for me. There is nothing much going on, or at least I hope there is nothing much going on, so that I can catch up on a little bit of sleep and maybe relax a little. You may feel like that too. Many of us are on vacation, and even if we are at work, so few people are around or even paying attention to email that we might actually be able to get caught up on projects that we otherwise would not get around to. At least that is my hope this week. So we need these in-between times, times that are not consumed by the hyperactivity that surrounds days like Christmas and New Year's Eve. Even the appointed gospel reading for this first Sunday during the Christmas season seems like an in-between time. Jesus is no longer a baby, but not yet an adult. In fact, apart from the birth narratives, including as a small child in Matthew's gospel, this is the only story in any of the gospels about anything from Jesus' childhood. So often I refer to this story as Jesus in confirmation class, because he's 12 and he's in class. And while a story of parents losing track of their kid is a scary story, particularly if you have been a parent who's been in a situation like this, it's an utterly normal story, like we might hear today. There are no angelic pronouncements. There are no miracles. There are no heavenly voices. Instead, Luke relates a very in-between story that happens after the big festivities of Passover have come to an end. Everybody is heading home, not unlike after some of the Christmas holidays, and since people traveled in big groups for safety in those days, Mary and Joseph assume that Jesus is hanging out with his buddies somewhere in the group. When they find that this is not the case, they carefully retrace their steps, finally ending back in the temple in Jerusalem, where they find Jesus sitting around in confirmation class, asking questions of the teachers in the temple. Exasperated, Mary asked Jesus what could have compelled him to do this. And Jesus, showing himself to be fully human and fully 12, rolls his eyes at his dumb parents and says, "Duh, why didn't you know I would be here? What's wrong with you?" And with that, they all head home, and we don't hear anything more about Jesus for about another 20 years. In fact, all the years between Jesus' birth and his baptism by John about 30 years later seem like in-between years. Nothing much is reported about them, and even this story seems like a routine event in between big cosmic changes. So why did Luke even bother to include it? Some scholars think that he wanted to make a point of Jesus' humanity, even by acting fully like a 12-year-old. Some scholars think that Luke included it to highlight Jesus' obedience to his parents, since he goes home with them and is obedient to them, following that very important commandment to honor your father and mother. And some scholars think that Luke wanted to use this story to show Jesus' commitment to God and to God's Word by his devotion to study and spiritual growth, even from a very young age. All of those things are possible, and none of them are mutually exclusive, but I think there's also a message here about living and experiencing God in the in-between times. For in fact, even for Mary and Joseph, the big cosmic events were few and far between. Most of their lives, like most of ours, often felt like in-between times. They got up, they went to work, they took care of things, they went home. And yet, Jesus was living and growing in the midst of those in-between times. And even if nothing miraculous seemed to be happening, God was at work and calling Mary and Joseph and the whole world into a deeper and more meaningful relationship with him. So, what does this story tell us about living and experiencing God in those in-between times? It seems to me that as utterly common and ordinary as some of the actions of Mary and Joseph were, they show us that living faithfully in the in-between times is often about keeping our eyes open and looking diligently for what God is doing in our lives and in the life of the world around us. I mean, Mary and Joseph didn't just figure, hey, Jesus has got to be somewhere, he'll turn up eventually. They actually go looking for him. They retrace their steps. They didn't give up. And I think sometimes we're tempted to sit back and wait for God to show up in our lives. Hey, when God is ready to show up in my life, he will show up and make himself known, and I'll just sit back and I don't have to pay any attention. But sometimes, the in-between times are the times when we are supposed to be called to keeping our eyes open, looking for the clues, noticing the small things, and looking for those seemingly ordinary things that happen in our regular, ordinary in-between times. Sometimes, living faithfully in the in-between times is about wrestling with what God is doing, even and especially when we can't quite figure it out. In a phrase that's repeated in today's gospel reading from the birth story, Mary treasured all these things in her heart. It's the same phrase that's used when we're told that Mary treasured the things that the shepherds told her. But that word doesn't mean stash it away as a beautiful memory like a treasured Christmas tree ornament which we'll pull out again next year. It really means to keep it with concern, to hold on to it, to not take something that you don't fully grasp and go, gee, I'm not sure about that, okay, I'm going to stash it over here, but to keep looking at it, wrestling with it, picking it up again and looking at it. Faith in the in-between times isn't about, I've got it all figured out and I can move on to the next thing, but continuing to wrestle with what we've experienced and what we're continuing to experience in God's world all around us. And sometimes living faithfully in the in-between times means simply going about our everyday in-between lives. At the end of the story, there is no dramatic finale. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus simply return home and they go about their daily lives. And it was in the context of doing what they did day in and day out that Jesus increased in wisdom and years and in divine and in human favor. That is, God was working out his plan through people's everyday in-between lives. And that's often the way it is in our lives too. And sometimes God is doing things with us and in us and among us that we don't really even notice because we're just busy doing the things God calls us to do, the ordinary things, each and every day. So today we are in the midst of the in-between times, but often that's exactly where God needs us to be. For God is always working in our lives and calling us to be part of what he's doing. And even though being part of God's plan sometimes happens at unique and dramatic moments in our lives, most of the time, God is working in us and with us and through us, precisely in these in-between moments.